Don't take on so, Alma. He's worth more to this family now than he ever was alive. That is what my husband's mother said to me at the graveside with the dirt already going onto the box. And she did not say it in temper. She said it the way a woman reads a feed bill. 14 months before that morning, I had sat at my own kitchen table and signed my name as a witness to a paper my husband's brother told me was the renewal on the crop loan. It was not the crop loan. It was a policy of insurance on Ellis's life for $2,000, and the man it paid was not me and not our little girl. It was Alma Reddick, against a note for $180 that Ellis had already paid better than half of. Ellis drowned at the Salt Creek Ford on the 14th of March, 1935, going out at 11 o'clock at night for a doctor, for a child who was not sick. Hollis Bewley, who was coroner of Cowlitz County and also the man who sold us the coffin, wrote "accidental" on the certificate without ever stepping down off his buggy to look at the water. He had written that same word 4 times before in 18 months, and every one of those men had a paper on his life with another man's name where the wife's name ought to have been, and every one of those papers was written by the same soft-spoken man in a gray hat who came through our county twice a year and remembered the name of every child on every porch. It took me 19 months, a telephone operator, a doctor's daybook, a printed program card from a schoolhouse exercise, and a letter my husband wrote in January that nobody was ever meant to see. On the 8th of October, 1936, I stood up in the town hall at Bellamy in front of 200 people and made every one of them learn what a man in Cowlitz County was worth by the quarter. But it did not begin that way at all. It began quietly, with a knock at the door and a man being polite. Before we go any further, tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight. It always amazes me how far these stories travel, and I read every one of them. Now settle in, and let me take you back to Kansas. We had the west half of a quarter section 3 miles out of Bellamy, on the road that runs along the top of the divide. The wheat came up in 1932 like a promise, and came up in 33 thin and yellow at the root, and by the spring I am telling you about, the fields were the color of a burlap sack, and the fences on the north side had drifted into the second wire. When the wind came out of the southwest, we shut the windows and stuffed wet rags along the sills, and my daughter would put her face in my apron until it went by. Ellis Reddick was 31 that year and had hands like a man 10 years older, all across the knuckles. He was not a talker, and I never could join in when women complained about that in a husband. Because Ellis had a way of setting a cup of coffee down beside me at 4 in the morning that said more than an hour of somebody else's conversation. He did the work of 2 men on ground that was doing its best to quit on him. And on Saturday nights, he washed at the basin on the porch and put on a clean shirt and drove us into town whether there was money to spend or not, because he said a person ought to see other people's faces once a week, or they forget what their own looks like. Our girl was 4 that spring, and her name was Winnie, for my grandmother. She had Ellis's straight brown hair and my temper, God help her, and she followed her father through the lot like a dog. He let her ride on the horse's back at the end of the day, holding her by the ankle, walking alongside, and she would talk the entire way from the barn to the porch about nothing at all. And he would say, "Is that so?" and "Well now," in the right places. And that was the whole of their conversation for the 4 years she had him, and I would give a good deal to hear about 10 minutes of it again. The money was thin, and it was thin for everybody, so it was not shameful, it was only the water we swam in. What we had that many did not was the place itself. Ellis's father, Harlan Reddick, had put that quarter section together out of 2 homesteads in the 90s, and when he died in 1928, he left the east half to Orville, who was the elder, and the west half and the house to Ellis, because Ellis was the one who had stayed home and worked it while Orville was in Wichita selling automobiles and marrying a woman who did not last a year. Orville came back in the spring of 29, 3 months before his father's stroke, in a suit and a hat better than anything in the county, and he had a way of standing in a doorway that took up the whole of it. He was 2 years older than Ellis and 2 inches taller, and he had the kind of laugh that makes a room look at him. When he lost the east half's crop in 31, he never once said so out loud. He borrowed instead, off Ellis, in pieces, a little at a time, and he always said the same thing when he did it. "You'll get it back with the wheat, El." And Ellis always said the same thing back, which was nothing at all. Their mother lived with Orville on the east half, in the old house. Ida Reddick was 66 that year, with a face like a hatchet blade, and hands that were never in my life still, and she came over Tuesdays with mending, and taught Winnie her letters at my kitchen table, and she did not like me. She never said an unkind word to my face in 8 years. She simply had, in her mind, an order to things. And in that order, Orville was the one who had come back, and Ellis was the one who had never gone anywhere. And I was a Lloyd from over by Ivy Bend, whose father had lost his land in 24. The insurance man's name was Carl Dietz, and he first came up our road in the fall of 1933, in a gray Ford with a dusty running board and a gray hat he took off before he was all the way out of the car. I want to be honest about him, because it matters. He was not oily, and he did not talk fast. He was about 40, thin through the shoulders, and he asked after your people by name, and he remembered. He came into our kitchen that first day and said, "Mrs. Reddick, I am not going to try to sell you anything you can't pay for. I make my living off quarters, not off dollars." And that was the truth, in a way. What Carl Dietz sold in Cowlitz County was industrial insurance, the weekly kind, 25 cents a week for a burial policy. He came around every month or 2 and collected the quarters and put a stamp in a little red receipt book with a rubber band around it, and initialed the stamp with a pencil he kept behind his ear. Half the county had one. It paid $70 or $100, enough for a coffin and the hole and a stone if you did not get proud about the stone. And in those years, the poor farm and the county lot were a real horror and not something you read about. So we took the quarter a week on Ellis and the quarter a week on me, and the little red book lived on the shelf over the kitchen clock, and Winnie used to climb on a chair and snap the rubber band against the table until I took it away from her. 50 cents a week, out of a house that sometimes had $1.40 in it. Ellis said it was money spent on being decent, and there were not many ways left to spend money on being decent. I have thought about that sentence more times than is good for me. Carl Dietz came in January of 1934 with Orville, and that is the evening I want to tell you about, because that is the evening I did it to myself. It was the 14th of January, and there was ice on the inside of the north window. Ellis had come in at 6 with his eyebrows white, and we had eaten, and I had the lamp on the table and a basket of Winnie's stockings in my lap. When I heard the car, I thought it was somebody in trouble, because nobody drove out our road in January for pleasure. Orville came in first without knocking, the way he always did, and stood in the middle of my kitchen slapping his gloves against his palm. "El, I've got Carl Dietz out there freezing in the car over a piece of paper. 10 minutes and he's gone." Carl Dietz came in behind him with his hat already in his hand, apologizing for the hour, saying he had been at the Souls and the road was closing up with drift and would we mind terribly. He took the chair I gave him and laid a leather case on my table and said, "Mrs. Reddick, that is the best coffee smell in this county, and I have smelled them all." Ellis stood by the stove with his cup and did not sit down, and I noticed it, and I put it away without thinking, the way you put a thing on a shelf you do not intend to go back to. I do not remember all of what was said, and that has been a torment to me. I remember the words crop loan were used more than once, and that Orville said them and Carl Dietz did not correct him. I remember Orville saying, "It's the renewal, and the company wants a name on it that isn't a Reddick, and Alma's a Reddick by marriage, which is different. That's how they figure it." And I remember thinking banks were full of strange arithmetic, and it was not my business to understand it. Carl Dietz turned the paper around so it faced me and laid his finger on a line at the bottom, below where Ellis's name was already written out in ink. "Just here, right along there. It's only saying you saw a man sign his own name. That's all it ever means." Ellis said from over by the stove, "What's the amount on it?" "Same as it was," Orville said, not turning around. "You know what it is." There was about 3 seconds of quiet in my kitchen then, and I have gone back into those 3 seconds 10,000 times since. Ellis was looking at the back of his brother's head. Winnie turned over in the bedroom and said one clear word out loud in her sleep, and all 3 of us glanced at the door, and the moment went past. Ellis drank off his coffee and set the cup in the pan. I signed my name, Alma Lloyd Reddick, in my best hand, because I was 24 years old and proud of my writing, and a man had asked me to witness something. Carl Dietz blotted it and put the paper away and stood up and said the thing I could never afterward get out of my head. "Good night, ma'am. That's a fine little girl you've got in there. That's the whole of it, isn't it? That's what a person works for." Then they went out to the car and stood talking in the yard longer than 2 men talk when it is 10 degrees, and I went to the window with my hand on the cold glass and watched the 2 shapes of them by the running board and could not hear one word. Orville laughed once. That is what I remember. On a dead-still January night on top of the divide, my husband's brother laughed at something in the dark, and I turned back to the lamp and finished the stocking. Ellis did not say anything about it that night, nor for 11 months after. What he did instead was go quiet in a different way than his ordinary quiet. It is easy for a woman to go back over a year and paint signs on it that were not there. But there were signs. In February, he asked me twice about the burial policies. Twice, out of nowhere, he asked exactly what the little red book on the shelf paid out and on whom. The second time I laughed and said, "Ellis Reddick, are you planning something?" And he did not laugh back. He said, "I just want to know what's ours." Ours. I thought it a strange word to put on a burial policy, and I gave him the book, and he sat with it a while at the table and put the rubber band back over the corner exactly the way I always did. In June, he stopped taking work off his brother. For 6 years, the 2 of them had swapped work at Harvest, our team for his help, and that June, Ellis put in with the Vosburg boys instead, and told me it was because Clay Vosburg had the newer binder, and Clay Vosburg's binder was 10 years old, and everybody in the county knew it. In August, at the Farm Bureau picnic in the grove by the river, I came around the end of the tables with a pan of beans, and the 2 of them were standing between 2 wagons, and Ellis was saying, low, "Then you tear it up in front of me and we'll say no more about it." And Orville said, "You don't tear up a thing like that, El. It's a contract. "It's the same as money." And Ellis said, "It is not the same as money." Then Orville saw me over his shoulder, and his whole face changed the way a lamp changes when you turn the wick up, and he said, "Alma, now that is a woman who can cook," and took the pan out of my hands and carried it to the table for me, and Ellis stood there between the wagons with his fists in his pockets and his ears red. I asked him about it that night in the truck going home with Winnie asleep across my lap. He drove a while. Then he said, "There's a thing I got to undo, and I'd rather undo it before I tell you about it, so you don't have to carry it twice." I said, "Was it money?" And he said, "It's worse than money, and it's my fault, and I'll fix it." That is the last conversation of any size that I had with my husband about anything that mattered. There were 400 conversations after it about the cow and the roof and whether Winnie needed shoes yet, and they are all precious to me now, and none of them are that one. On the 14th of March, 1935, at about 10:30 at night, a car came up our road. I was already in bed. Ellis was still up because he had the lamp on over a harness he was mending in the kitchen, and I heard the knock in the door, and I heard Orville's voice, and I did not get up. That is the second thing I would change, if the Lord ever let anybody go back and change two things. He said, and I heard it perfectly clearly through the wall. "It's Nola. She's burning up, and she's been at it since supper, and Ma says, 'Get the doctor.' My car quit on me at the corner. Take the team. It's flooded at the ford, but the team will walk it." Nola was Orville's little girl, 9 years old, and she was as much to Ellis as our own. I heard my husband stop what he was doing. I heard him say, "How bad?" I heard Orville say, "Bad." I got up then and came out with a quilt around me. Ellis was already getting into his coat. He said, "Go on back to bed, honey. It's cold." He said, "I'll be back before you know I'm gone." He put his hand flat on the top of my head, the way you do to a child, which he had done since the first week I knew him, and he went out, and the wind took the door out of his hand and banged it, and he pulled it shut behind him from the outside. I never saw him alive again. They found the team at daylight standing in Vosberg's pasture with the tugs broken, and they found Ellis 140 yards below the ford, in the willows, with his coat still buttoned to the throat. I am not going to describe that day to you. I will tell you 3 things about it, because all 3 turned out to be part of what I am telling you. The first is that Hollis Bewley came out about 9 in the morning in his black buggy, being the coroner, and sat up on it in his good overcoat with the reins in his hands, and looked down at the creek and said, "Well, that water come up 2 feet since Tuesday. That's a hard thing." He never got down. He asked Clay Vosberg 2 questions. Then he drove back to Bellamy and by noon had written "accidental drowning" on a certificate in his own office, which was also his furniture store, which was also where they were building my husband's coffin while he wrote it. The second is that Alma Reddick was not sick. When I came into Ida's kitchen at 8 that morning, the child was at the table eating oatmeal, and she looked up and said, "Aunt Alma, is Uncle Ellis in heaven?" And Ida turned from the stove very fast and said, "That will do, Nola." I stood in that doorway and felt something go through me like a wire. Then somebody put a chair under me and a cup in my hands, and there were 11 people in that house by then. And by afternoon, I had told myself the child got better in the night, because children do, and because the other thing was not a thought a person could hold and go on standing. The third is what Ida said at the grave 2 days later, which I have already told you, and which I am going to say again now that you know what it cost. They had the box on the boards, and the men were letting it down with the ropes, and Winnie had her face in my skirt, And Ida Reddick took hold of my arm above the elbow, tight, the way you take a child that is about to run into a road. And she put her mouth close to my ear and said, "Don't take on so, Alma. He's worth more to this family now than he ever was alive." For 11 days after the funeral, I did what widows do, which is answer the door. Verna Sowell brought a ham and did not say one word about the Lord's plan, which put her ahead of most. Clay Vosberg mended the corral gate Ellis had been meaning to get to, and left before I could come out and thank him. And every night after Winnie went down, I sat at that table with the harness Ellis had been mending still over the back of his chair, because I could not make myself move it. And I did the same arithmetic until it went dark outside the window. Here is the arithmetic. $81 in the bank, a note of $340 against the spring seed and the taxes due the 1st of October, a cow, 11 hens, a team I could not feed, and 160 acres that took a man from 4 in the morning until dark to make lie down and behave. I was 118 pounds, and I had a 4-year-old. Carl Dietz came on the 3rd of April with his hat in his hand before he was clear of the car. He would not come in past the doorframe at first. "Mrs. Reddick, I have been on this road 9 years, and this is the part of my work I would pay to give away." Then he sat down where he had sat in January and took the little red book out of my hand and checked the stamps one by one with the pencil from behind his ear, and said the quarters were paid up through the 6th of March, and the company would not be niggling about the last week and a half. He wrote the voucher out at my table. $70, the check to come out of Kansas City in 8 to 10 days. "It won't do much," he said, and I said no, it would not, and he said, "It'll bury a man and leave a woman her pride, and there was a time I thought that was a small thing." I signed the voucher. Then I asked him a question I did not think anything of when it left my mouth, and it changed the whole rest of my life. "Mr. Dietz, was there anything else of his with your company? Any other paper? I'm trying to get to the bottom of what we've got." He was putting his pencil back behind his ear, and he stopped with his hand up at his ear, and he did not look at me. He looked at the middle of my kitchen table. It went on long enough that I heard the clock over the shelf, which I had not heard in 11 days. "There was an ordinary policy," he said. "An ordinary policy? Yes, ma'am." "For how much?" "That would be—" And here he did look at me, and he had gone a color I did not like at all, gray under the shave. "Mrs. Reddick, that one is settled already. It went out on the 29th of March. It went to the beneficiary of record, and that's the whole of the company's obligation on it, and I am not at liberty—" "Mr. Dietz," I said, "for how much?" $2,000, he said. $2,000 in Callow County in 1935 was not money. It was a different kind of thing than money. It was 4 years of a good year, and there had not been a good year since 28. It was every acre I was sitting on, twice over. And the first thing I felt was not grief, and not even suspicion. It was a flood of pure animal relief, a hot loosening in the back of my knees, because for 11 days I had been carrying that arithmetic, and here was the answer to it. And I put my hand flat on the table and said out loud, "Oh, thank God." Then I saw his face, and the bottom went out of it. "It didn't come to me," I said. "No, ma'am." "Then who?" "The beneficiary of record." "Mr. Dietz, my husband is in the ground 5 weeks Tuesday. Say the name in my kitchen." He put both his hands on his knees like a man about to stand up, and then he did not stand up. He said, "Orville Reddick." And then he said, fast, the way a man says a thing he has rehearsed on the road, "It was a creditor's policy, Mrs. Reddick. It's an ordinary arrangement. There's a note behind it. The company doesn't write a thing like that without a note behind it. And there is a note. I saw it myself. It's perfectly regular. It is done in every county I work." And I said, "How much is the note?" He got up then. He got his hat off the table and turned it around by the brim twice, and he said, "You'd have to ask your brother-in-law about that." And he went out to his car, and I came out onto the porch after him in my apron with no coat on in an April wind. And I stood at the top of the steps and I said it to his back across the yard. "How much is the note, Mr. Dietz?" He had the car door open. He stood there in the wind with his gray hat in his hand and his hair going every which way. And he was 40 years old and he looked 60. And he said, $180, ma'am. And then he said something I did not understand for another year and a half. He said, "I'd have got out of it if they let a man out of it." Then he got in and drove away, and the dust from his car hung over the road all the way to the section corner and settled. And I stood there on the step until I could not feel my hands. Notice what I did with that, because it is the part I am least proud of and also the part I think most people would do. I did not go to a lawyer. I did not go to the county attorney. I went to the family. Because that is what you do when you are 25 and your husband has been dead 5 weeks and the whole world you have got is 4 people and a road. You knock on the door and you say, "There has been a mistake. Help me straighten it out." I got there about 4 in the afternoon. There was a truck in the yard of the East Place that had not been there before, a Chevrolet. Not new, but 3 or 4 years newer than anything either of those brothers had ever driven. And a man from the elevator was standing beside it with Orville, and the two of them were laughing. Ida let me in. She had flour to the elbow and did not stop working. Nola was doing sums at the table, and Ida sent her out to the chickens in a voice that did not allow for discussion. And the screen door banged, and then it was the two of us. And Ida wiped her hands on her apron and said, "You've heard then." That is what she said. Not, "What is it?" Not, "Sit down." Not, "Are you all right?" I stood in the middle of my mother-in-law's kitchen and felt the floor of the last 8 years of my life tip about 4 degrees. "How long have you known?" I said. "Since the day of the funeral." Carl Dietz told Orville at the church. At the church, on the step, before the service. It's business, Alma. Business doesn't stop because there's a service. She went back to the bread with her back to me, 66 years old with a straight spine and her hands in the dough, and she said the next part in the exact voice she used to say the beans wanted salt. "That money is going to save this family. You'll get the good of it in the long run. There's no call to go making a noise." Then Orville came in from the yard, and he was still smiling from whatever the elevator man had said. And he saw my face, and the smile came down, but not all the way. And it never did come all the way down in any conversation I had with him for the rest of his life. "Alma," he said, "now hold on. I know how this looks." $2,000, I said. "Sit down." "I will not sit down. $180, Orville. Ellis paid you back 100 of it. I watched him count it out on this table in October, and you put it in your shirt pocket." "That's not how the paper reads," he said. There it is. 25 words into it, and there it is. And if I live to be 90, I will hear him say it in that easy voice with his thumbs hooked in his belt. "That's not how the paper reads." "Then read me the paper." "It's at the bank in Bellamy, in a box," he said, "and it's my business, and it's between me and Elle is gone. Now, Alma, listen to me, because you're going to have your hand out to me by August, whether you like the sound of that or not. That ground of yours needs a man on it. You can't work it, and you can't hire it worked, and you'll not make that note in October. I'm not throwing you off it. I would never do that. Ma's already said you and the girl can have the front room here, and in the fall we'll see about— Say the rest of it, I said. He put his hand up, palm out, patient, the way you gentle a horse. In the fall we'll see about putting the two halves back together the way Pa had it. That's all. That's all I've ever wanted, and Elle knew it, and there's nothing in this world crooked about a man wanting his father's place whole. And behind him, at the counter, without turning around, his mother said, Amen to that. I did not scream at them. I did not throw anything. I have wondered since whether it would have gone better if I had. What I did was stand in that kitchen with my hands hanging down at my sides and hear the clock on their shelf and the chickens outside and Nola singing to herself by the coop. And then I said, the 14th of January last year, in my house, you told me it was the crop loan. Orville looked at me for a good 3 seconds with nothing at all on his face. Then he said, Alma, honey, you signed it. You put your own name on it. Who do you figure that helps? I drove into Bellamy the next morning, and I was at the door of the bank when Mr. Coyle unlocked it. And I had rehearsed my voice in the truck the whole 3 miles so that it would come out level. And it did. The note was real. That was the first blow of that day, and it landed before I had my gloves off. Mr. Coyle brought the box out himself and turned it so I could read it. $180, dated the 9th of August, 1932, 6%, payable on demand. Ellis's signature at the bottom, in Ellis's cramped, upright hand. Nobody had forged anything. My husband had borrowed $180 from his brother in the worst August of that decade and signed for it like an honest man, and had paid 100 of it back across my own kitchen table with no receipt asked for and none given, because you do not ask your brother for a receipt. Is there any endorsement on the back? I said. Any credit? Mr. Coyle turned it over. It was clean. He was a decent old man with a daughter my age, and he did not look at me while he said, Mrs. Reddick, a payment that isn't wrote down did not happen, in law. I have seen that ruin more families than drink. Then he did the one thing in that room that helped me. He took a piece of the bank's own paper and wrote out for me, in a clerk's hand, the address of the Ashmore Mutual Assurance Company in Kansas City, Missouri, and the words, Home Office, Claim Department. You write, and you keep a copy of what you write. A company will answer a letter. A company is not your brother-in-law. So I became a woman who wrote letters, and I would like anybody who has grown up since the telephone got cheap to sit with that a minute. There was no way to simply ask. I wrote on the 14th of April, and the answer came on the 2nd of May, 3 sentences signed with a rubber stamp. The company's obligation had been discharged in full to the beneficiary of record, and the company could not furnish information concerning a contract to a person not a party to it. I wrote again on the 4th of May and asked for one thing only, in a way a clerk could act on without going to anybody. A certified copy of the application, because my name was on it as a witness, and any person has a right to a copy of a paper bearing her own signature. Then I waited 19 days, and in the middle of that waiting I found the other thing, and I found it because of a mouse. There was a harness room off the barn where Ellis kept everything he was too tired to put away properly, and on the 21st of May I went in for the leather punch and found something had been at a sack of oats and dragged chaff into the box where he kept his catalogs and tally books. I got down on my knees to clean it out, in his old coat, with the smell of neat's foot oil and dust and horse in the boards all around me. And that was the only place left in the world where he was still completely alive. I sat back on my heels and howled like a dog for about 4 minutes. And then I wiped my face and kept cleaning, because that is what the days were made of. Underneath the tally books, there was a seed catalog from the fall of '34, and folded inside the back of it, twice, there was a piece of tablet paper with pencil on both sides. I did not know what it was for a moment. I saw crossings out, and I thought it was figures. Then I saw the shape of it, the way the lines sat on the page with a space at the top, and I knew it was a letter, and my husband did not write letters. He wrote on the backs of envelopes what a man owed him for custom work. In 8 years, he had written me exactly 1 letter from a threshing job at Ivy Bend in '29, and it was 4 lines long, and I had it in the trunk in the house at that moment. It was a draft. He had written it out in pencil to get it right before he made the fair copy, the way a man does who is not sure of his spelling, and the date at the top was the 21st of January, 1935. Sirs, I want to change the beneficiary on the policy on my life, number 419662, wrote by your agent C. Dietz in January of last year. I want it to read my wife, Alma L. Reddick. I did not understand at the time what I was signing, and I have got it clear now. There is a note of $180 behind it, of which $100 is paid. My brother has not agreed to it, but the life is mine, and I am the one paying. Please advise what is required. Respectfully, Ellis H. Reddick, Bellamy, Kansas, Route 2. There were 2 crossed-out places. Where it said, I did not understand at the time what I was signing, he had first written something else and scratched it out so hard the pencil went through the paper, and if you hold it to a window, you can read it. What he wrote first was, my brother lied to me and to my wife. I sat down on the floor of that harness room with my back against the wall, and what came up in me was not grief, but rage, with the taste of a penny at the back of my throat, and my hands shook so hard the paper made a sound like a moth against a lamp chimney. He had known. He had gone about it the way he went about everything, quietly, alone, without letting me carry it, and he had written to the company 8 weeks before he died and asked them to put my name on it. And 2 months later, he was in the willows below the ford with his coat buttoned to the throat, and his brother had the money. The copy of the application came on the 9th of June in a long brown envelope, and I made myself read every word of it in order, and it was worse than I had got ready for. There was my name in my best hand on the witness line, under Ellis's. There was the amount, $2,000, ordinary life, quarterly premium of $11.40, more than we spent in a month on everything that was not seed. Where it asked the relationship of the beneficiary to the insured, the agent had written brother and creditor. And where it asked the nature and amount of the beneficiary's interest in the life of the insured, in Carl Dietz's small, tidy hand, it said, advances and notes, $2,100. The note in Mr. Coyle's box said $180, and that premium, $45.60 a year out of Cowlitz County in 1934. My husband never paid, and could not have. I went back through my own book for that year, every egg check and every cream check, and there is no month in it where $45 could have gone by me. Orville paid the premiums. Orville kept a paper alive that was worth $2,000 to him the day my husband stopped breathing, and told the company Ellis owed him $2,100, and told me it was the crop loan, standing in my kitchen with my daughter's picture on the shelf behind him. I took that application to Junius Pratt on the 11th of June. He was 71, with one lung from the war, and an office over the drugstore with a window that would not shut. And I put it on his desk and said, "Is any of this against the law?" He read it twice, turned it over and looked at the blank back, and turned it again. Then he took his spectacles off and cleaned them on his necktie a while. "Mrs. Reddick, there is a rule older than either of us. A man may insure his own life for any sum on God's earth and name whoever he pleases, but a creditor may insure his debtor only to the extent of the debt, and the reason for that rule is the plainest reason in the law." He put the spectacles back on. "It is so that no man in this country shall ever have a money reason to want another man dead." He wrote 2,100 where it says 180, I said. "What is that?" "On a good day, that is a false statement in an application, and it makes the policy a wagering contract. And a wagering contract on a human life is void from the beginning, and the company can be made to say so." He took a breath, and it whistled a little. "On a bad day, it is the first line of an indictment, and you had better be very sure of what you are starting, because you have a little girl, and you live 3 miles out of town on a road nobody goes down." I did not sleep that night. About 2 in the morning, I got the little red book down off the shelf over the clock and went through it stamp by stamp. My husband's quarters, 1.5 years of them, each one initialed C.D. in pencil. And on the second page, in the middle of a column, there were 2 stamps where the date was written in a hand that was not Carl Dietz's, and the initials under them were H.B. Hollis Bewley. The coroner, the undertaker, collecting the burial quarters on a route that was not his, 3 months before my husband drowned. That was the first thread that came loose, and I sat in that kitchen and pulled it, and the whole county came apart in my hands. Verna Sowell lived 4 miles east on a rented 80 with 3 boys and no man, and I drove over on the last Saturday in June with a jar of pickle on the seat as an excuse. Her husband Lem had gone up in the hayloft to throw down feed at 5 in the morning the November before, and come down through the chute head first. And Hollis Bewley had ridden out and looked at the barn floor and said, "Well, that's a hard thing," and written, "accidental." She knew why I was there before I had the jar out of the truck. She was hanging out a wash, and she stood with a wooden pin in her mouth and watched me come across the yard, and took it out and said, "You've been to see old Pratt." I sat on her step 2 hours. Verna was 33 and looked 45, and had the flattest way of talking I ever heard in a living person. Lem had carried a policy for $1,500 written by Carl Dietz in the spring of '34, and the beneficiary was Emmett Dye, who owned the 80 they rented and had let them run about $210 behind. Dye collected the whole $1,500 in January and came out the following week and told Verna in front of her boys that he was a Christian man and would carry her another year on the rent. "I wrote to Topeka," she said, "the insurance department of the state of Kansas, in December. I got the girl at the school to help me put it in the right words. And on the 11th of February, a man come out here from the company. Not Dietz, a district man, big-built fellow with a gold tooth and the nicest manners you ever saw. He said there had been an irregularity in the writing of the policy, and the company wanted to make it right, and he counted out $40 on that step, and he had a paper for me to sign saying I withdrew my complaint and was satisfied. You signed it. Mrs. Reddick, I had $11 in this house and 3 boys, and the oldest of them was going barefoot into November. She looked at me the way you look at somebody through a window. You'd have signed it too. Don't tell me you wouldn't. I don't like being lied to on my own step. I said no. I said I would have signed it. Then she went in and came back with a shoebox and took the lid off. And inside was a burial book, red, the same as mine, and Lem's watch, and a folded copy of that letter to Topeka. The girl at the school made me a copy before I sent it. I never told a soul I had it. Before I left that evening, the two of us had made a list out loud on the back of a feed bill. Otho Kern, October of 33, off a windmill tower he had climbed 1,000 times. $500 to Bewley's furniture store against a funeral account of $61. D. Mabry, May of 34, overcome by gas cleaning a cistern with two men standing on the rim who never smelled a thing. $1,000 to Fay Trigg at the elevator against a feed bill. Lem Sowell, November of 34, $1,500 to Emmett Dye against $210 in back rent. Roscoe Teal, February of 35, smothered in his own wheat bin in the middle of a day when nobody was moving grain. $750 to Fay Trigg. Ellis Reddick, March of 35, $2,000 to his brother against a note of $180. 5 men in 18 months. 5 different beneficiaries, so no one name ever showed up twice, and nothing looked like anything at all. 1 agent wrote every policy. 1 coroner wrote out to every one of them, and never once got down off the buggy and wrote the same word 5 times, and got the burying of 4 of the 5. "They're careful," Verna said. "They're careful the way a man is careful when he does a thing more than once." I drove home in the dark past the ford where my husband died, and I did not look at it. And the thought that came to me about 1 in the morning is the thought that made all the rest of it possible. It was not who killed Ellis. It was this. They did not have to kill anybody. Not most of the time. A man who goes up a windmill in October and down a hay chute in the dark and into a cistern and into a wheat bin. This county killed a man like that about every 6 weeks, all on its own, for free, and had been doing it since 1880. All you had to do was be the man holding the paper when it happened, and the man who wrote down afterward what it was called. And then, once in a while, when a particular man got troublesome and wrote a letter to Kansas City in January, you could help it along, because who on this earth would ever be able to tell the difference? I took all of it to the county attorney on the 8th of July, in a flour sack because I did not own a case. Foy Larkin gave me 40 minutes, which I will always grant him, and read every paper I put on his desk. Then he squared them up and laid both hands flat on top of the stack. "Mrs. Reddick, I believe you have been badly used, but a coroner's certificate is a public record, not a piece of gossip, and it stands until it is knocked down, and I cannot knock it down with a list of coincidences and a widow's arithmetic. Every one of those deaths has a way of happening that anybody in this county could tell you before breakfast." He sat back. "Bring me one fact, one, something that is not a coincidence, and I will go to a grand jury with it, and I will not care whose cousin anybody is." I have no complaint about Foy Larkin. He told me the exact truth in July, and it is the only reason I ever got anywhere, because if he had petted me and made promises, I would have sat home a year waiting on him. What he did was send me home with a job of work. The floor under all of it gave way in August, in Ida Reddick's kitchen, over an envelope. I had gone to take Nola a dress I had cut down. Ida was on her hands and knees blacking the stove, and she said without stopping, "There's mail of Ellis's come here a while back. I meant to bring it to you, and it went out of my head." She got up and went to the cupboard and took down the tea tin, and out of the tea tin she took a long envelope, opened, addressed to Mr. Ellis H. Reddick, Route 2, Bellamy, Kansas, with the Ashmore Mutual Assurance Company across the corner, and a Kansas City postmark of the 2nd of February, 1935, 6 weeks before he died. In the tea tin, 7 months after. I sat down at that table without being asked. 1 page. The company was in receipt of his letter of the 21st of January. The policy had been assigned in its inception for the security of an indebtedness. The beneficiary named could not be changed without the written consent of the beneficiary of record. The company was communicating with the beneficiary and with the writing agent and would advise him further. Communicating with the beneficiary. In the first week of February, they wrote to Orville Reddick and told him his brother was trying to take the paper off him. 5 weeks later, his brother was in the creek. "Where has this been?" I said. "In the tin?" "Ida, where has it been since the 2nd of February? And here it comes, and I want you to understand that she did not lie to me. She never lied to me once in her life. She only did not tell things." She wrung out her rag and folded it over the rail of the stove and squared the corners and said, "It come in the box on the road with the rest of the mail, and I brought it in the house and I gave it to Orville because Orville is my son." "Ellis was your son?" "Yes, and by that February I could see how it was going to go. One of them was going to break the other one. So I sat right there and thought about which of these 2 houses is going to be standing in 5 years, and which one has a man in it that can talk to a banker. And I chose. The kettle ticked on the back of that stove. Out the window, Nola was walking the fence line with a stick. I remember my hands were folded in my lap like a woman waiting on a train, and that I felt nothing at all, which frightened me worse than anything I had felt yet. "You chose," I said. "I did. And you'll thank me in 10 years when that girl of yours has a place to be married out of." "And when they carried him up out of the willows," I said, "and you stood in the door with your hand on the frame, you had already read that letter." Ida Reddick looked out her own window about 4 seconds. Then she said, "You will not put that on me in my house," and got back down on her knees with the blacking, an old woman, on the floor, with her back to me. That was the end of the only conversation about it she and I ever had. Orville came for the land the last week of August, politely, and in front of a witness, which was a thing he was careful about from then on. He brought Fay Trigg from the elevator, and the 2 of them stood in my yard by that Chevrolet truck, and Orville took a paper out of his shirt pocket and unfolded it and held it where I could see it and not touch it. He had bought my note at the bank. $340, seed and taxes, due the 1st of October. He had paid Mr. Coyle off in the middle of the month and taken an assignment of it, and now he held it. And he stood there in a clean shirt, explaining in a kind voice that this was the best thing that could have happened to me, because a bank forecloses on the 1st of October, and a brother-in-law does not. "Sign the west half over to me," he said, "and I'll put it in writing that you and the girl have the house as long as you want it. Nobody is throwing anybody out. You'll have the front room at Ma's, or you'll have your own house, whichever suits you, and this note goes in the stove tonight while you watch. That is not a hard bargain, Alma. There's 40 women in this county would take that deal on their knees. And if I don't sign it?" He put the note back in his pocket and buttoned the flap, and he said it with Fay Trigg standing right there hearing every word, which is exactly why he said it. Then the 1st of October comes, and the sheriff sells it on the courthouse steps, and I buy it there. And you get the front room anyway. But you'll have made me spend money to get what Pa meant me to have, and I will remember it, and there won't be any house for you in it. The 1st of October. I had 34 days. The click came on the last day of August, about 20 minutes after Orville drove out of my yard. I had gone in the house shaking and got as far as the table and stood holding the back of a chair with both hands, saying in my head the words a person says, which are, "What am I going to do?" And then I heard Winnie out on the porch singing to a cat, 4 years old, making up the words as she went, perfectly happy, on a place her father had put together with his hands. Something in me went over, the way a wagon goes over when the load shifts, all at once and quietly. The shaking stopped. My hands came off that chair steady, and they stayed steady for 14 months. I have never been able to explain it better than to say I stopped being a woman, something was happening too. I was at Junius Pratt's door at 8 the next morning. "Can he have my place on the 1st of October?" I said. "No, he can frighten you on the 1st of October. That is a different article." A demand note is not a mortgage on land. To reach the ground, he would have to sue me, get a judgment, levy on it, advertise it, sell it, and in Kansas, I would have 18 months after that to redeem it. "He can have your place in about June," said Junius Pratt, "if nothing whatever goes wrong for him between now and then." Mrs. Reddick, a great deal is going to go wrong for him between now and then. That week, Pratt filed our suit, and it was not against Orville. It was against the Ashmore Mutual Assurance Company of Kansas City, and it asked the court to say that policy number 419662 had been void from the day it was written because a creditor had sworn to a debt of $2,100 that was in fact $180, and a paper like that is a bet on a man's life and not a contract of insurance. That petition was the crowbar, though I did not know it then. A company will ignore a widow. A company cannot ignore a petition on file because a petition has to be answered in 20 days by a lawyer who bills them, and the answering makes them go and look in their own file drawer. And once a company has looked in its own file drawer, it can never again say it did not know. Then came the winter, and I will hand you a whole year in one paragraph. Clay Vosberg put in my wheat on shares in September and would not take a signed thing on it. I sold the team in November, which was the day I finally cried where somebody could see me. Because that was Ellis's team, and one of them would put his head over your shoulder. I milked and sold cream and sewed for 3 families in Bellamy and kept a ledger of every cent in ink, because Mr. Coyle's sentence about a payment that isn't wrote down had gone into me like a nail. I paid Orville's note down $40 in January and $11 in February and took a receipt every time. He always took the money standing in my yard, and every time he took it, he said something kind with a hook in it. And all that winter I worked on my 3 facts, the way you work at a knot in wet leather. The first one came to me in the middle of a hymn in the back of the Methodist church and nearly took the top of my head off. The East Place had a telephone. It had been on the farmer line since 1929, on the wall by the door, and I had used it myself. My place did not. And on the 14th of March, at 10:30 at night, with a child of his supposedly burning up with fever, Orville Reddick had come the 1.5 miles from his house to mine to send my husband 9 miles for a doctor, past 3 farms with telephones, from a house with a telephone in it. I asked him about it once, in the yard, and he said the line was down, and it went down all the time in a wind. That is a perfectly good answer, and there is exactly one thing in this world that can be laid against it, which is the operator's record. Bertie Nance had the night board at the Bellamy Exchange, a small, freckled, frightened girl of 19 who would not talk to me for 2 months and finally did in the back of the drugstore over an ice cream she let melt. In a country exchange, you write down every call because the company wants the tickets, and the exchange's own book stayed in the back room until it was full. She had the spoon in her hand the whole time and never once put it in the dish. Mrs. Reddick, I was on that night. I remember it for the wind and for what come after. That line was not down. There was a call out of the Reddick place at 9:40, and it was answered. Answered by who? By Bewley's, the furniture store. I put it through myself. Mr. Bewley sleeps over the store. 9:40 at night. 50 minutes before my husband's brother knocked on my door about a doctor. The second fact took me until April to think of, and I have never forgiven myself for how long that was. Dr. Foss kept a daybook, as every country doctor did, because he had to bill people eventually, and half of them paid in hens. I asked him for the page for the 14th and 15th of March, and he laid it on the counter without one question, being that kind of man, and there was nothing on it. No call, no drive, no visit, no charge. He turned the page back and forth twice and looked at me over his glasses and said, "Alma, I was in my bed the whole of that night, and it is the only night in that entire month that I was." The third fact had been in the house all along, and Nola handed it to me herself in the summer of '36, because I asked her what she remembered about that spring. She was 10 by then. She brought out the cigar box where Ida kept things about the children and turned it over on the floor, and among the valentines and the report cards, there was a little cream-colored printed card from the Sunflower District School. Spring exercise, 4th on the list of recitations. The Wreck of the Hesperus, Miss Nola Reddick. And across the top of it the date, Thursday evening, the 14th of March, 1935, at 8 o'clock. I sat on that floor with the card in my hand, and I could hear Ida in the kitchen with the pump. The child had stood up in a lighted schoolhouse and said a poem at 8 in the evening. At 10:30, her father stood in my kitchen and told my husband she had been burning up since supper, and Ma says, "Get the doctor." And at 9:40, in between the two, somebody in that house rang the undertaker. The last piece came from a rooming house at Ivy Bend, 3 weeks before I went back to Larkin. The Ashmore Mutual had let Carl Dietz go in the spring, when their lawyers finally opened the file drawer. I drove over there to shout at him, and did not shout at him. He had his root books in a grip under the bed, 9 years of them, and he put them on the table and did not make me ask twice. $15 a policy, entered as canvassing expense, paid to H.B. 5 times. "I never touched a soul," he said. "I want that said someday in a room with people in it." He turned his hat around by the brim the way he had on my step. I wrote what they told me to write and collected quarters off people I liked, and when a man died, I drew a commission on the claim, and I told myself for 9 years I was an insurance man. Mrs. Reddick, they don't have to pay anybody to do murder. They only have to make it worth a man's while to be standing there when it happens, and to be careful who does the writing afterward. I laid all of it on Foy Larkin's desk on the 10th of August, 1936, in a proper case Junius Pratt had loaned me, in the order it happened, and I did not say a word while he read. When he was done, he got up and stood at his window with his back to me a long time. "Mrs. Reddick, do you understand what happens to this county if I do this?" "Yes." "Hollis Bewley buried my father." "He buried my husband," I said. "He charged me $31 for the box and then wrote down what it was called, and he was paid $15 by Carl Dietz on every one of those 5 policies. And Carl Dietz will say so himself, in a chair, out loud." Larkin came back and sat down and pulled a pad toward him and did not look at me. "The 8th of October. I'll call a jury and ask Judge Haskell to appoint a special coroner, because the one we've got is going to be sitting in a chair with his hat in his hands like anybody else. The town hall. It will not hold the crowd." The night before it I did not sleep, and I did not expect to. My black dress was pressed over the back of a chair by 8 o'clock. Winnie was 5.5, and she got up twice for water because she could feel it in the house. And the second time I let her into the bed, and she went to sleep against my arm in about 2 minutes, the way children do, in the exact spot where her father used to sleep. I lay there and went through it in order, in a whisper, the way I had 300 times. The application, the note in Mr. Coyle's box, the pencil letter of the 21st of January with the crossed-out line, the company's answer of the 2nd of February out of a tea tin, the exchange book, the day book, the program card, the route books, and Ellis's voice in the truck coming home from the picnic, saying there is a thing I have got to undo. About 4 in the morning, I got up and lit the lamp and took the little red burial book down off the shelf over the clock and put the rubber band around it and put it in my handbag. I was 26 years old. My husband had been in the ground 19 months. And I said out loud to that kitchen, "All right, Elle, I've got it clear now." They held it in the town hall at Bellamy on the 8th of October, 1936, at 10 in the morning, and by 9:30 there was no place to sit, and men stood 3 deep along the back wall with their hats in their hands. Judge Haskell had appointed Ransom Hale from the county seat as special coroner, the elected one being a witness, and there were 6 men in the jury chairs, and every one of them farmed, and every one of them had been up a windmill tower in his life. Hollis Bewley sat in the 2nd row in his good overcoat with his hat on his knee. Orville came in at 5 minutes to 10 in a new gray suit with his mother on his arm and a lawyer from the county seat behind him, and he shook 2 hands going up the aisle, and he looked at me once and gave me a small nod, the kind a man gives a woman he intends to be generous to later. Foy Larkin made no speech. He said, "This inquiry is into the death of Ellis Harlan Reddick on the 14th of March, 1935, and we will take it in the order it happened." And then he began putting people in the chair, and it went like a hand of dominoes going over one at a time. Miss Lorena Pyle, who taught the Sunflower District School, identified a printed program card and said that on the evening of the 14th of March, 1935, 22 children gave the spring exercise before about 60 people, that Nola Reddick recited The Wreck of the Hesperus, 4th on the program, and got all the way through it without a prompt, and that her father drove her home about 9:15. Dr. Foss read out his daybook for the 14th and 15th of March and said there was no entry of any kind, that no person had called him to the Reddick place or anywhere else that night, and that if a 9-year-old child in his practice had been burning up with fever since supper, he would have heard of it inside a week, and he never heard of it at all. Bertie Nance came up in a coat too big for her, and had to be told twice to speak toward the jury. She read from the exchange book, a call placed from the Reddick farm on the east half at 9:40 in the evening of the 14th of March, connected to the Bewley furniture store, 4 minutes. The farmer line was not down that night. She was on the board until midnight, and no call for a doctor came out of Cowlitz County at all. You could hear the hall change. It is a thing you can hear. Carl Dietz came up with his gray hat in his hand and the grip on the floor beside the chair. And he sat there an hour and 40 minutes and took that county apart. He identified 5 policies in 18 months and read out what each one paid and to whom. And then Larkin had him read out what the notes behind them were. And the difference between those 2 columns of numbers went into that room like cold water. He read out $15, entered as canvassing expense, paid to HB 5 times over. He read out the letter from the district office, asking him to kindly advise as to the health of the insured on the larger contracts. Then Larkin said, "Mr. Dietz, on the 2nd of February, the Home Office wrote to you about Ellis Reddick's request to change his beneficiary. What did you do with that information?" And Carl Dietz said, "I got in my car and drove out to the East Place and told Orville Reddick that his brother was trying to take that paper off of him." He looked at his hands. "That is the whole of what I did. I have thought about it every day since, and I would give my right arm." Somewhere back of me, a woman said out loud, "Lord God." Mr. Olin came after that, the district man from Kansas City, big built with a gold tooth, exactly as Verna Soule had described him, and he did not enjoy 1 minute of it. The company had sent him with the whole file, their lawyers having told them it was better to be helpful. The application with my name on it. The premium receipts, everyone paid by Orville Reddick's own check. The draft for $2,000 cleared the 11th of April, 1935. And then he took out 1 page and said, "This is the insured's letter of the 21st of January as received at the Home Office." The original. In ink, in Ellis's cramped, upright hand, on the good tablet paper he kept for figuring, the fair copy of the pencil draft I had found in the harness room under a seed catalog. Ransom Hale read it out to the room in a flat voice, every word, and when he got to, "I did not understand at the time what I was signing, and I have got it clear now," I looked at the floor between my shoes and held on to the arms of the chair, because I was not going to give that room the sight of me. They put Ida on before me, and she was in the chair 11 minutes. The envelope had come to the box on the road. She had brought it into the house and given it to her son Orville. No, she had not mentioned it to Ellis. No, she had not mentioned it to me. When Larkin asked her why not, she looked straight out over the heads of everybody in that hall and said, "Because it was between the 2 of them, and I do not carry tales." Then she sat down next to Orville and folded her hands and did not look at anybody again. Then they called me, and I was in that chair 50 minutes, and most of it was paper. This is my signature. This is where the man said crop loan. This is the note, $180, the 9th of August, 1932. This is the little red book with the quarters in it, and here on the 2nd page are 2 stamps in a hand that is not the agent's, initialed H.B. And then Foy Larkin said, "Mrs. Reddick, tell the jury what your brother-in-law said to you in your kitchen on the night of the 14th of March." I told them. I told them the words in the order he said them, and my voice did the thing I had made it promise to do, and stayed level all the way through. And when I got to, "It's flooded at the ford, but the team will walk it," Orville Reddick stood up in the 3rd row and said, "Now that is a lie. His own lawyer had him by the sleeve. Ransom Hale hit the table twice with the flat of his hand and told him to sit down and that he would have his turn. But I had turned around in that chair by then, and I was looking at him over 200 people, and Hale did not stop me. And I have wondered ever since whether that was an oversight or a kindness. "You had a telephone on the wall by your own door," I said. "It was working at 9:40 that night because you rang the undertaker on it. And with a child of yours supposedly burning up with fever, you walked 1.5 miles in the dark, past 3 houses with telephones in them, to the one house in this county that had no telephone, to find the one man who would go." He said, "Alma." $180, I said. "That is what all of this was. You could have had it. You had only to come and ask me for it, and I would have counted it out on the same table where you told me it was the crop loan, and I would have made you a cup of coffee while I did it." Nobody in that hall made a sound. Bewley was looking at his hat. "And you," I said, and I looked at him, and that was the only thing I said to Hollis Bewley in my life. "You were paid twice on every one of them. $15 to write the word and $31 to dig the hole." The jury was out 1 hour and 10 minutes. They came back and Ransom Hale read it, and it said that Ellis Harlan Reddick came to his death by drowning in the waters of Salt Creek on the 14th of March, 1935, that his death was procured by the willful design of Orville Reddick, that the certificate of the coroner of Cowlitz County was made without inquiry and was false, and that the jury recommended that the county attorney proceed against Orville Reddick, Hollis Bewley, and Carl Dietz. I want to be honest with you about what came of it, because people in Cowlitz County have told this story for 50 years, and they always make the ending bigger than it was. They never convicted Orville of killing his brother. Larkin told me straight out on the courthouse steps in November that no jury in Kansas would hang a man on a telephone call and a program card and a poem recited by a child. And he was right. And the murder charge was dismissed in February for want of evidence. What they convicted him of in June of 1937 was obtaining money by false pretenses and conspiracy to defraud, on the strength of the words $2,100 written on that application. Judge Haskell gave him 1 to 5 years at Lansing and said from the bench that it was the lightest sentence the law allowed him and that he regretted it. Hollis Bewley was put out of the coroner's office by the Attorney General in January, pleaded to the $15 business, paid a fine, and kept his liberty. He lost more than that. He had buried this county for 19 years, and after that October, there was not one family in it that would let him touch a member of theirs. The store went in 38. He died at his sister's at Hutchinson in 1944, and they brought him back and buried him here, and I am told 11 people came, and I was not one of them. Carl Dietz was never tried. Larkin used him and let him go, and he wrote to me once a year at Christmas until 1951, and then stopped, and I never answered one of them, and I have never decided whether that was righteousness or plain cowardice. The district court held in March of 1937 that the policy had been a wager on a life and void from the day it was written. Orville had 1,150 of it left, and the truck, and the court took all of it, and the company paid me the difference in a settlement its lawyers were anxious to keep out of the newspapers at Topeka. The east half was sold at sheriff's sale on the 6th of June, 1938, to satisfy Orville's judgments, and I bought it. I bought it for $1,180 with the money the paper on my husband's life had made, and I stood on the courthouse steps in the same black dress, with Verna Soule holding my arm. And when the sheriff said, "Sold to Mrs. Alma Reddick," there was a sound went through that crowd that I can hear yet. So the two halves of Harlan Reddick's quarter section came back together after 10 years apart, exactly the way Orville always said his father meant them to be. There is no way to say that sentence without it sounding hard. It was hard. Ida came to me in the fall of '38, when the East Place was mine and she had nowhere on this earth to go. And she stood by the gate Clay Vosberg had mended and did not ask. She would not have asked if she had frozen. It was Nola who asked, 12 years old, standing beside her grandmother with a suitcase in both hands. I took them in. I put Ida in the front room, and I have never been able to think about that without something turning over in me. Because the front room was what she had offered me in her own kitchen as the price of not making a noise. She lived in it 11 years. We were never easy. We were civil at the table, and we worked a garden together, and we buried a good deal of what we knew. And one time only, in the winter of '43, with the war news going on the radio, she said out of nowhere, "He was a better man than the other one, and I knew it the whole time." I did not say anything back. That is as near as either of us ever got. She died in that room in 1949, and I sat with her the last 2 nights and held her hand, because there was a girl in that house who loved her, and I was not going to have Nola remember it any other way. Nola was raised here from 12 with Winnie, and the two of them shared a bed and fought like cats and could not be separated. And she never once called me anything but Aunt Alma, which was right. She married a Vosberg boy in '46 and named her first daughter after me, which put me out on the porch for 20 minutes with a dish towel over my face. Orville came out of Lansing in 1940 and went to California and wrote to Nola twice and then did not. And he died at Bakersfield in '55, and the county did not talk about it much. Winnie got 2 years at the Teachers College at Emporia. Nola got 1. The little red book is still on the shelf over the clock. Not that one. That one is in the tin box in the trunk, with the application and the pencil letter and the program card, and it will go to Winnie, and I have told her what every page of it is. The one on the shelf now I started in the fall of '39, ruled by hand, and there is no company's name across the top of it, and no man's initials in the margin. It is quarters put by every Saturday in my own writing, and what it buys is not a hole in the ground and $31 worth of pine. He is worth more to this family now than he ever was alive. That is what she said to me over the grave, and she was doing arithmetic, and she was wrong, and it took me 19 months and 200 people in a town hall to prove it out loud. My husband was worth 160 acres, and a girl who got to go to Emporia, and another girl who did not have to grow up in the house that did it. He was worth every quarter I ever put in a book, and in 50 years, I have never once called that crossing by its name. I call it what it is. It is the place where they thought nobody would ever count. Well, friends, that is where the story leaves us, and I have a question for you tonight. Alma took Ida into the front room and sat with her at the end and held her hand, and I have never been able to make up my mind about it. Was that mercy, or was it the last thing she did to her? Tell me what you think in the comments. I read every one. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. There should be a playlist coming up on your screen with other stories from this channel, and I would love it if you stayed with me a while longer tonight.